immigrant myself,
Sorry.
topic around immigrant identities meant so much for me to know and to understand what the process is when it comes to workplaces. So I will share my screen and get started. Can I get a confirmation that the screen is visible? Yep. Awesome. All right. So the outline for today's session, I want to talk a bit about how the historical development of identity happened or came about in scholarly literature, especially focusing on the management literature, because identity has been a topic in many disciplines, many areas of studies, but in the interest of the audience that we have and also my research interest, I'm going to narrow it down to what we find in management literature. So as I go along the presentation, you would see I'm discussing what we broadly see in management literature, and then a bit of deep diving into where management literature borrowed these concepts, because as we know, management literature or the discipline of management is a combination of what businesses or management practices would have been. Therefore, the theoretical lenses were borrowed quite often from sociology, psychology, and social psychology, because as an actionable discipline, we didn't have theoretical roots to start off the discipline and research on. So what it meant is that because that we borrowed a lot of literature from different disciplines, there's concession, there's conflict around what you see in the management literature when it comes to identity or how you define identity. So part of my work for my thesis was to kind of detangle what this meant. What did I understand when it comes to the roots of identity literature that's often used in management scholarly work. And then I'll also briefly touch on identity work, because from where I stand in my as a researcher, my philosophical standing inevitably put me in a place to discuss identity work as part of identity construction. So I think I need to preface this conversation by saying I'm a qualitative researcher. Therefore, some of the things that I say are very much around social construction of identity. It is not to say that identity studies or research on identity cannot be quantitative, but this is the approach, or this is the truth for me as I do research. So I think that's very important as we go along the discussion here. Don't assume that quantitative research in identity is not favored upon. You'll see a lot of research that have been done on taking a quantitative approach. But for me, the presentation today, it'll take a more qualitative approach to identity construction. And then, because it's going to be a bit of an information dump at the very beginning, I'm going to show you what I did with my identity research and give you a practical example of how I made sense of sociological views of identity in the management literature when conducting my research. So, all right, after giving through that huge outline for my session, I have a question for everyone. I'm going to give it 30 seconds. Think for yourself. How would you answer the question, who am I? I'm going to keep my mouth shut. 30 seconds. Think for yourself. How do you define who am I? All right, I'm assuming everyone had a bit of thought. How would you respond to that question? Quite often when you get asked who are you? Or you question yourself looking at the mirror, who am I? You're talking about what is your sense of self. For me, before I deep dive into the literature, we all have to kind of come into this place of common understanding what identity is, because identity in different literature have very different meanings. So in management literature, what we are looking at is our sense of self. It sometimes might be the way you define the profession you are in, the religion you belong to or practice, or the school you went to. For example, I identify as an alumni of University of Colombo, and identify as an immigrant woman in Australia. So these are social categories that help me define who I am. However, at the deep down, I also have my values, ethos, and pathos that define who I am. All these come into play when you try to answer the question, who am I? When it comes to management literature, because organizations, so management literature often look at how people interact and function in organizations. So we are essential actors in organizations or institutions. How do we make sense of ourselves in these organizations is what we are looking at when we are trying to understand what identity is. I hope that kind of gave a very layman understanding of what we are looking at when we try to talk about identity literature. Because when I had a quick chat with Dr. Adhikaram, she told me that it's not quite often used in the faculty at the moment, and there are a few people who are starting to grapple around the topic of identity. So I wanted to make sure that we all understand identity in the sense we discussed here is what we are looking at, how people interpret themselves, define themselves, maybe to attribute, relating to attributes deep down in themselves, characteristics, personalities, qualities, or it can also be social identities or social group memberships that you would have day in and out. But if you think long enough, you would see or you would feel, I identify as A, but I also identify as B. For example, I identify as a professional woman. I also identify as a woman with Sri Lankan upbringing. They don't often overlap seamlessly. They would have conflicts. That's why we talk about identity as a complex and a multifaceted conceptualization of sense of self. So bearing all these in mind, hoping that you kind of got an idea what I'm going to talk about, what identity in management literature. I'm going to quickly touch on historical traces of identity. As I initially told, identity has been all over the place. We see effects of Plato talking about what sense of self is. And I think as Sri Lankans, we often come across our religions talking about what our sense of self is, how we identify ourselves as an individual. And philosophies, religions often define what a good person, what a bad person, what a meritorious person would be. But the Western debate on identity, however, has started to look more into what philosophers like Kant, Hume, and Locke have talked about ethics and a person's place in the society and their responsibility towards the society. While these are all available for us, these have limited written documentation or coherence around what they meant when it comes to conceptualizing identity. Therefore, researchers over time have moved away quite a lot. When I say researchers, I'm meaning what we find in management literature has quite often moved away from discussing these philosophers' work when defining identity. For obvious reasons, there's lack of coherence. They can't make sense of what exactly these people hypothesized around what identity is. So having said that, I'm not going to touch on a lot of these different angles when it comes to identity. In this presentation, we are solely looking at what we see in management literature, because as researchers coming from a Faculty of Business, Human Resources division, we need to find a place to anchor ourselves when it comes to literature and build our work on if you're going to research on management, on identity fitting into management literature. So I'm going to start. I already told you it's very scattered and dysfunctional when it comes to identity literature for the reasons that we have borrowed a lot of information and ideas from psychology, social psychology, and sociology in management literature. So next few slides or this few minutes of the discussion, I'm going to go through identity studies broadly in management literature, and then how social psychology and sociological views inform identity literature. And I'm going to remind you, you will see a lot of times me gravitating towards sociological views of identity literature in this discussion. That's because inherently, as a qualitative researcher and a person thinking that the truth is socially constructed, that's where I have based my research on. Okay, so discussing the scope of identity studies in management literature, we often come across scholars named Andrew Brown, Down and Reveley, and also Ashford. They come up quite often as people or scholars who have defined identity and who've often contributed to identity literature. So Brown has said, for him, identity is meanings individuals attach reflexively to themselves. So I made you at the very beginning think about how you define yourself. That's your reflexivity coming into practice. You are in retrospect thinking, how would I answer this question? How would I answer to someone else what it means to be myself? And also you might often notice this reflexivity doesn't often mean that you are publicly presenting yourself as the same person that you would think you are in front of the mirror. That's the beauty and the complexity of identity literature that we often see. And also that is the reason why it becomes really hard to understand why some of the seminal work doesn't make sense to us, because these scholars are talking of different angles to look at what sense of self could be. And Brown also, in his previous work, have said people subjectively construed understandings of who they are, who they were, are, and desire to become. Like I mentioned, you wouldn't tell me some of the things that you thought who you are. And that could be sometimes the past, and you no longer present yourself as that person. Or in social interactions, you don't want others to know that you were something else. You calculate what it is in the future benefit. Therefore, these subjectively construed understandings vary quite often along the time trajectory, who you want to become or who you are, who you were. And management literature, often you would see scholars appreciating more of sociological approach to identity, because they see that identities are performative, that are dramaturgical, and both directed at yourself and the other. I'm going back to you having 30 seconds to think, how would you define yourself? It's all both internal and external, how you define yourself. But as researchers, this becomes really hard for us to conceptualize or quantify how someone would identify themselves. And also, Brown, in his latest work, have talked about how people would answer the question, who am I? How people would attempt to answer the question of who am I, thinking all sorts of self-cognitive and emotional processes that they would go through, and also the social boundaries. So as you can see, the sociological view takes you through a journey of how you relate to the society and the social structure. And if you've also started looking at identity literature, you would see often social identity theory and the identity theory. These come from social psychological perspective on identity. So we do have identity literature that's coming from psychology, which I am not discussing for the reasons we are not often psychologists to talk about the neurons and how our cognition works. Management literature or the management theories don't necessarily support the biological processing, understanding the biological processing that is discussed in psychology. Unless we are fully aware of these connections, it's hard for us to fully conduct a research taking a psychological approach to identity, unless you have resources or like a collaboration, for example, that can bring in social psychological views. I wouldn't necessarily see us succeeding in taking a purely psychological approach to defining identity. So social psychologists, what they've kind of done is they bring in the society as well. They also talk about the psychology of identity, but they also bring in and situate the identity in the society, or for example, the organization, the institution. So I'm going to discuss social identity theory and identity theory as well in a bit. So the nature of work and organizational studies. So in this discussion, I'm going to use work and organizational studies, vice versa, because often management literature talk about work and organizations, the basic or the context forms in how people function in these institutions. So broadly, the literature has looked at studies that think, how do managers shape organizations which they are part of? And what are the factors that come into play when they're developing their identities at an individual level? What are external regulatory factors that could affect identity construction? So you would see identity being discussed, but then also a new term comes to place, identity construction. So it is a bit of a debate currently in literature whether identity is a concept or a reflective frame, or identity construction is what we should be studying. Can you study identity is a discussion up for debate in scholarly work that we see often. And until recent times, I would say the last 2 decades or last decade, we often saw management literature looking at identity as a homogeneous function. They decided, all right, we are studying managers, for example. The white manager is the same as the brown manager. A female manager is the same as the male manager. So there is a lot of emphasis on managerial identities in management literature without considering other societal factors that would contribute to defining your identity or your sense of self. So this has become quite a practice for the until last decade or 2 decades to the max, where we didn't see differentiation between identities. We did not see management literature considering how identities can be different. So this is built on the idea that society is relatively stable and orderly, where they would assume, all right, it's a manager, there'll be leadership traits, there'll be managerial traits. That's what we are studying. But we are seeing progress in management literature. We are increasingly starting to see identities of visible minorities and gender discourse coming into practice when it comes to management literature. I've given a couple of examples for you to at one point go and see. For example, Ate Vaughan has often looked at British Black personalities in the workplace, and Narendra Reveli and Almeida had looked at, I can't remember exactly, the gay lesbian community in India. That was the generic topic of them. And Fernando Reveli and Leomon Fernando, we also have him in the audience, one of my supervisors. They've looked at how a brown identity of a business scholar would span out in an Australian workforce. And Corinne Knockmore, they've looked, this is one of the seminal works when it comes to identity literature in management that quite particularly look at intersectionality. They've looked at how women in South Africa with Indian descent have worked their identity, being people of color, being a suppressed group of people in a South African setting. So you start seeing these differences being identified and being researched and bringing in a bit of flavor to the homogeneous understanding of how people function in organizations or how people construct identities in organizations. So as I mentioned, intersectionality as a platform to discuss identity is now coming into practice. And I think I've looked at a couple of presentations that were done in this roundtable session. Intersectionality is an upcoming topic to discuss identity because we are recognizing that individuals have more than enough conflict in their sense of self for us to understand how they function in an organization. So this is what we broadly see in management literature at this point. So now, next, I am going to move into what management literature has in place, taking a sociological view into identity. So this is me going back in history, looking at the seminal work that has informed management literature when it comes to defining identity. So the literature supports the idea that social psychological perspective of identity is a more pragmatic approach to psychology and sociology in defining identity. So moving away from the psychological view of identity, social psychologists bring in an aspect of individuality and also an aspect of society when discussing the construction of identity. In a way, moving from the psychological sense of identity, they're downplaying the internal psychological aspects, but as fitting to management literature or management research, they're bringing in the society, the social construct, the hierarchies within institutions. This is very important for us as management scholars because conceptualizing of identity solely from a psychological perspective takes away the place individuals would have in an organization, because an organization is a social construct. We cannot look at a social construct and people or actors within a social construct without placing these actors within the social construct or the organization. So psychological view solely looked at the individual from a cognitive point of view, biological functionality, how people would define their sense of self. Social psychologists appropriately moving towards bringing in the society, the social function into defining identity. Often we would see Ashworth and Mail talking about individual subjective interpretations of who they are based on socio-demographic characteristics, roles, personal attributes, and group memberships. So something for you to notice, which will be beneficial as we go through, is these are social identities. These are group memberships they are defining identity based on, because socio-demographic characteristics are given to you. The concept around being a woman, a man, is a socially constructed, is a group. There is a definition around what it is to be a woman or a man. What it is to be a teacher, doctor, lawyer, a social construction. That's not very individual. It's given by the society. So you could see where social psychological view is kind of inkling towards to when it comes to defining identity. And also, in a sense, to give an answer to the sense of self as who am I, the question, the big question, who am I? Social psychological view often takes or gives more merit into social memberships or group memberships. So this is very important for us to understand why some of the management literature would have moved away from the social psychological view, or why some of the scholars still sit with social psychological views on constructing identity. So how the social psychological view came about is that it has actually started with the work from Charles Cooley and Herbert Mead. You've often would have seen these two names coming up, where Mead's work, the seminal work when it comes to defining identity that has informed management literature, talks about the concept of self, and then tells something about I and me. For often us, I and me are the same. But from a social psychological viewpoint, me is the internalization of what society tells us, what society builds us onto as a person of color, a teacher, a woman, a man. So it is the society's understanding of what it is to be an individual. And I arises in retrospect later than me, because I is what you show other people. I is what you show the society or the public audience who you are. For an example, I would take myself as an example. So at this point, I'm looking very confident and talking about a topic that I've put many years into study. But that is what I want to show you as a confident person. But how I've internalized what I do, how I interact with the audience, and it's very different to what I portray. So this is why I keep going back to the question I asked you, how would you define yourself? And if I ask the question around the table and say, all right, tell me how you define yourself, you would see this difference of what you thought and what you give me as a reaction to my question. Because according to social psychological view, we are defining ourselves publicly in response to what other people would perceive ourselves. However, there is limited concession around how these I and me would combine to become an identity. So that's the problem that divides the literature. And when I first started my PhD work, that was the constant question where I'm like, all right, someone tell me how these two work. I'm going back to the point, lack of concession around some of these topics, definitions, has been the reason why some of these topics are abandoned by scholars without further exploration, because they cannot make sense of what exactly do they mean by I and me. You could make a general sense of it, but how do you connect it together to build this identity of a person? Because I and me cannot be two different people. At the end of the day, we are one person with different personalities maybe, but it's not right to say personalities in that sense. And then another approach in social psychology is defining yourself in relation to the other. So social psychological view, we're going back to the idea I define myself with respect to how I function among other people. In this sense, we are not really talking about the internal aspects of who I am, the conversation you would have with the mirror that others would not know. So there are loopholes for me when it comes to these definitions, because it's not telling me how an individual define themselves, both externally and internally, and how would they become one person, and how would they make sense of themselves without having to separate their identity or sense of self as, all right, I'm this person in public, I'm this person when it comes to myself just in front of the mirror. So as a result, we see cognitive processes where self-identity is willed as self-definitions or self-attributes, but they're all focused on the other, the general public. So in social psychological view on identity, you often see responses to others or how others would perceive myself as the definition guiding what identity is. For example, you would see this in social categories. You should now get an idea where I'm inclining to, because I'm talking about social categories of black and white, rich versus poor. These are all our responses to someone else, or the society, or the social construct that has said, I am this, I am rich, I'm poor. But we are moving away from discussing what your personal identity or your internal self-talk would be in constructing your sense of self. So this way of looking at identity yielded in two prominent theories that we often see. One being identity theory, which came out of the work of Stryker and colleagues, which is using social roles and self-verification to discuss what your identity is. Essentially, Stryker is talking around role theory and telling, all right, you take the role of a lecturer, that is your identity. You may have the role of a teacher, a lecturer, or that's not a good example. Let's say lecturer and a mother. Depending on what takes salience, your identity becomes that. So identity theory for myself lacks concession around what happens if I am both. Back in the day, in pre-modern era, this was easy. People had rigid boundaries around how you identify yourself. But no longer we have that liberty of just being, for example, the mayor. You often struggle with managing two different identities. For example, myself as an immigrant in Australia and being an academic, I often struggle. Do I come across as a person of color or an academic or just a mere woman? So the role boundaries have blurred in the modern society. It's hard for us to see which identity or which social role that I occupy becomes on top of the hierarchy. So identity theory, thinking of social verification or self-verification, and the role theory is defining your identity is the role that is most salient and taken up by yourself. So the roots of these roots of identity theory sits in symbolic interactionism and role theory, as they give Stryker enough context to work on in building what a social role would be. How would social roles connect individual humans? So one of my pain points when it comes to identity theory is that it only considers one identity at a time, talking about the salience of identity. So for me, when I'm researching, I'm like, this is not really true. I cannot just be one person in this society. I bring into play a lot of different identities due to multiple intersecting roles and social identities that I carry. So for me, from the viewpoint I stand, this theory didn't resonate much because I have more questions than answers provided by this theory. And then the second theory we have stemming from the social psychological view is the social identity theory. Very popular in the literature. You often see quantitative management studies taking a social identity theory as their basis to conduct research, proposed by Henry Tajfel and John Turner back in the day, another seminal piece of work to read if anyone's going down the path of studying identity. They looked at identity building on the concepts of social categorization, social comparison, and identification. Thinking of the roots of social psychological view, we are again going to social memberships or group memberships, looking at your identity in comparison to the other, with limited recognition for what's happening inside you or who you are as an individual, irrespective of the social groups, social memberships that you would hold. So there are two elements, distinct elements in social identity theory, which is one being social identity, as the name implies, and a separate entity called the personal identity. Tajfel and Turner doesn't really talk a lot about the personal identity. What they're only telling us is one's personal identity is their physical attributes, abilities, interests, psychological traits that inform their cognitive processes. And then they go to lengths to define what a social identity is, how in-group and out-group forms, how people find justification in constructing sense of self in comparison to the other or the out-group. So this begs for the question, so I have a personal identity and then I have a social identity, but I am the same person. How do I marry these two together if they're two different entities? Or how do I define myself in combination to both these different elements? Social identity theory definitely helps a lot of research in management literature because it gives you a place to isolate roles, or let's say the managerial identity or the professional identity. If you want to study a social identity in isolation, social identity theory gives a lot of premise and support arguments to build your study on this theory. However, as a person who's taking a social constructionist view on identity, I question, can I isolate my professional identity? When I walk into the university as an academic, do I leave behind all my social identities, other social identities? Do I function just by the rules of what the white world may have defined as being an academic? Can I function? Do others perceive me as an academic? They would perceive another white counterpart. So these questions beg us, how do you make sense of these two as two separate, two different entities of one person's identity? I started this discussion saying, I am a qualitative researcher. That does not mean quantitative research on identity is frowned upon. It is evident in literature. Quantitative studies take support from social identity theory quite often for the said reason of isolating one particular social identity for their studies or their research. Moving along, so I've tried to compare and contrast the two distinct identity theories that we see in our social psychological view on identity. Social identity theory builds on self-categorization, in-group, out-group idea, and then the identity theory goes on to talk about self-verification, attaching meanings to identities based on the role that you take, making meaning around the roles or memberships that you would take one at a particular time. So one of the other things I've mentioned here that is key is that self-identity and social identity being two separate elements in social identity theory, where in identity theory, there's no particular stance on where these two stand, but we see Stryker talking about identity salience, telling, all right, whatever is the most important is your identity. There's little thought around how different identities would conflict or interact with each other. And then identity considered not as a whole, but as an arbitrary collection of group memberships. So according to social identity theory, our identity is fragmented because we have different memberships. At different points, you would be a different person because they are being observed in isolation without heed into how they would interact. Where in identity theory, they believe there are various identities, but they also believe in a hierarchy where one on the top is at play. So again, we are neglecting the idea that we could have multiple identities, and at one point they all will be contributing to how you make sense of yourself. So for me, as a critic, is the lack of consideration to fluidity and the interconnectedness of different social identities come as a priority when I'm saying social identity theory didn't really resonate with me because I had more questions than answers around the lack of fluidity and interconnectedness. And then when it comes to identity theory, social roles are no longer rigid. Society is no longer rigid. Therefore, how do you identify the hierarchy? How do you define which role is coming on top as your priority when defining your identity as a person of color, as a person, for example, with disability, visible disabilities, part of social stigma? How do you figure out which identity, social identity, or which role is your priority? So I hope this makes a bit of sense around how different and similar social identity theory and identity theory is, which is stemming from the social psychological view on identity we find in management literature. Okay, now I'm going to move on to sociological views on identity literature and identity construction literature we find in management. So you would see in this section, I will talk a lot of merit in these approaches, once again reminding the qualitative researcher in me who find more who resonates more with the sociological approach. So sociological work started from about 1950s, started to bring in the work-related issues into the foreground of discussion of self-identity. So this is very appropriate for management literature because we have to anchor our research on identity in the institution. To talk about what happens in the organization, we need to bring the actor into the organization and discuss what's the relationship, how are we connecting each other, one as a social construct and one as a cognitive being. Social structures, also including historical circumstances, was one of the key things when it comes to sociological approach to defining identity in management literature. So, however, because we are borrowing ideas, concepts, theory from psychology and social psychology, sociologists in management literature are still also debating the private and public elements of what an identity is. Can you connect them? In the most recent work, I will take you through, some scholars have actually worked out ways and conceptualizations to bring all these together. That's where identity work come into play. So one of another key elements of sociological view is that lived experience within social structures are given priority. Back in the discussion we had around social psychology literature, I spoke, there is a lot of assumption that the society is rigid, stable, and orderly. Whereas sociological researchers bring in lived experience. They're giving the actor prominence, saying, all right, what has been your experience? How has that contributed to your construction of sense of self? And also you should note, there is a shift in language. Sociologists often go to talk about sense of self in place of identity, because they find it that talking about one identity, reducing identity to one element might be reductionist, because we have different elements. We have a self that we show the others, the public. We also have our internal discussions, and we also have ways in which we make sense of the institution, society we are part of. So the interactional, interdependent variables are considered when discussing what identity is in sociological view of identity. Moving ahead, so the seminal work that we see supporting sociological view come from Erving Goffman. Another seminal piece of work that I would recommend anyone to read is The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, a very light reading, unlike Tajfel and Turner's seminal work, which are written very much resonate in the psychological terminologies, way of looking at self. The presentation of self in everyday life is very much of a light read where you understand where and how they conceptualize identity. So Goffman used theatrical understanding to illustrate what sense of self is. They tell that they term it by saying front stage behavior and humans as actors and having backstage behavior. So what they're trying to say, in the functionality of society, the actors, us, we have front stage behavior and we also have backstage behavior. And we play with these two different types of behaviors as we go along, as we feel most appropriate. And again, another concept to bring into this discussion is how do you manage these two behaviors? How do you define working on these two backstage and front stage behaviors, which I'll touch a bit later. So key scholars to read on, Gubrium and Holstein, Hoffman, Watson 2008 are really good scholarly pieces of work for you to start reading if you're new to the sociological way of identity in management literature, because they've boiled it down to understandable content. We're moving away from the social psychological way of identity. And I mentioned in the previous slide as well, there is a shift of terminology and language to discuss self rather than an identity, a singular identity. So one of the interesting things, Gubrium and Holstein, in contrast to what we discussed in social identity theory and identity theory, is that they believe that the true self lies somewhere inside, central to subjective decision making. What they're trying to tell us here is there is society, there is social construction, but opposing to the social psychological view, the actor has the central agency to define who they are, not the social rules. They can inform, but who you become is your decision, and you have agency to act it out in a way that's more appropriate. So that's not a liberty we saw given in social identity theory and identity theory, where there was rigid boundaries around rules, what it is to be or occupy a certain role. But at the same time, they also talk about the inner self that could be socially influenced, but ultimately at a very deeper place. So these are elements that you think around your core values, your beliefs, that you wouldn't necessarily subject to influence of the society. We all have those values that you think, all right, this is something I'm holding true to. So these are not considered in social identity theory or the identity theory because of the prominence given to what the other might think or defining an identity around what the society has given it. So moving ahead, one of the sociologists that I resonate quite a lot, and this is their work is very contemporary at this point, is Tony Watson's work in defining identity in management literature. Watson highlights a concept called sociological imagination, where they talk social identities as cultural phenomena external to the self, but they act as input to the self-identity. All right, for the first time in my literature, I see a connection between social identities and the self-identities. While social identity theory told me there are two different elements, it didn't tell me how they connect. But Watson has managed to tell me, all right, you still do have two different self-identity and social identity, but they're not two different elements, they're connected. Your self-identity is influenced by what you see in the society, the roles that you take. So we are now departing from the idea social identities are separate to the self-identity. Once again, taking the path of other sociologists, Tony Watson is giving power to individual agency, the choice, creating a self at an individual level, saying, yep, you do have a separate personal identity or the self-identity, but you are influenced. That makes sense because we are social beings, we are in institutions, we are in societies, we get influenced by what is given to us, the perceptions around the roles that we take, and thus shaping our sense of self. So think back, some of the terms that you use to define yourself at the first 30 seconds, they're socially given, but they're framed how you behave. For example, so the society has given me an identity as a woman. How I make sense of it is culturally induced. I make sense of it individually as taking it on as my personal identity or the self-identity, but it's provided. It's not separate. My internal self and my social identity as a woman, they're not separate. They're being interconnected and influencing one or the other. So this brings us back to the reflective processes of social interaction. We are not individual beings that are functioning in isolation, especially in management literature when we are studying organizations and work. We need to make this connection around how people make sense of themselves as a reflexive process, being oneself, both subject and the object. You be functioning in the organization, but you also take credit into these are my values. This is how I interact with the other people or the society. So what we are building on here is a connection to the society, which we lacked in social psychological view on identity and the psychological view on identity, where there is a lot of interpretation around functioning in isolation or functioning on an orderly society where there are rigid boundaries around rules. So social psychologists moving forward gave me more understanding that historical, social, and cultural political events happen in the past also are part of who I'm becoming, how I define my identity. Again, an element that was not considered in social psychological view on identity. This helps me to understand there are multiple identities. This brings us to the popular topic these days on intersectional identities. So we're no longer talking about one identity. We're talking about individuals having multiple identities, but making sense of them in constructing their sense of self. So moving a bit ahead with Tony Watson's work, they defined identity taking into consideration how nationality, elements like racial, ethnicity, religious beliefs, sexuality would act as inputs to self-identity. So I started by saying sociologists consider there is a connection. Social identities influence self-identities. With the work of Big and Watson, now we have another term. They say they act as inputs to self-identity, yet again implying the influence and interconnectedness in constructing complex, recursive, and reflective identities which are under construction. Another element of temporality being brought into this discussion, because we did not see how identities evolve in social identity theory or the identity theory, because we had rigid boundaries around what it is to take a role. So sociologists supporting us to bring, all right, you change over time. There are elements of history, the economy, politics, but you would have an identity under construction at all times because you are recursing actors in a trajectory where there is a future. So in the interest of time, I'm going to quickly skim through to one of my best sought after conceptualization of how self-identity and personal identity would interact. This is forwarded by Tony Watson themselves. In 2020, a handbook of identity in organization was first published ever. We didn't have a handbook in literature for identity in management. So 2020, edited by Tony Watson, is one thick book that talks about identity in organization. in that book, Tony Watson conceptualized a nice connection between self-identity, social identity, which is a cultural stock or notion of what it is to be an individual in a society, and self-identity being individual notion of who one person is. And now he brings in a concept called identity work. This is the missing step that we did not necessarily see in social psychological view, because they did not talk how these two entities connect. And at the same time, if you remember at the beginning, I told you, you wouldn't necessarily have told me the same things that you thought about yourself. You would have an agenda around how you want me to perceive if I asked you the question, who are you? And he also brought in that concept saying, that is your persona, the public presence of yourself that you present to anyone else. You have social identities that are given to you, that are part of your life because of the roles you take. You have your self-identity, but at the same time, you have personas. All three entities are connected through identity work, where you manage the interaction or the conflict or the agreement between these three elements. Identity work is a process of individuals striving to shape how they build a relative understanding of their sense of self. This can be in the work of strategies they take or how you present. This can vary from strategies such as dressing up properly or dressing in a sense that would fit for the role, or even not talking a particular language. Think around accents, taking accents when you're talking or eliminating accents, giving out parts of your names or not telling people the truth, the white lies. They're all ways in which you can manage your identity around the personas you present to someone else. So sociology gives me a place to understand what is given to me, the social identities, the self-identity, what I hold true to myself, and how I present myself in public spaces. So just to give a brief understanding on identity work, it is debated whether it's a concept, construct, a metaphor, or is it a perspective, or any combination of these. But one of the widely used definitions by Alverson and Wilmot is identity work constitutes an act of forming, repairing, maintaining, strengthening, or revising one's identity to achieve sense of coherence and distinctiveness. So in your presence in public, you would take up ways in which you could manage your impression, how others perceive you, and also how you would feel about yourself in social institutions where you interact with other people. So identity work involves mutually constitutive processes where you have internal discussions around how you want to understand yourself and how you want to present yourself, and also performative functions, which are outward, where you take leverage on different social identities you would hold. And Ibarra and Babel School gives us an idea that there are two underlying assumptions that are, one is external display of the roles and the characteristics that you would work on, and then the internal identity discussion that you would have. Because at times you could act like a certain person, but at the same time, you would feel like you're not living truthful to yourself. You can pretend to take up a new name because it fits in the area or the country or the organization you are in, but it would feel like I'm losing sense of myself. So an example is in Australia, often Asians, Southeast Asians, take up Anglo-Saxon names because it's easy for the host community to understand that name and say it back. But internally, this individual would struggle because they've grown up with a name that's very close to their heart, often given by their parents, have meaning attached, but is being let go of at this point. So this is why I said, or the literature is telling us, identity work is a two-way process. You might be very happy outwardly, giving out a new name, identifying yourself as a different person, but internally there'll be a lot of turmoil. This is why understanding identity work comes of crucial value in workplaces, because it gives us a glimpse of how an individual would feel working in an environment where they're not allowed to be themselves. And some of the examples I can give around identity work, this is a long list of a literature review that I've done. This is not a know-it-all list. There's many identity work strategies, but often when someone starts looking into identity and identity work literature, you would come across passing and covering as strategies. Passing is engaging in information control. You pass to be someone else. Often back in the day, the pre-modern era, women would dress up as men to take up jobs, go to wars, or be part of the society because they were not allowed. So there's stigma involved in this particular identity work strategy where they're like, I'm concealing part of my stigma, therefore others would perceive myself as this. We often see this example in movies back in the day talking about historical development. We also see in those movies how women would feel lost when they're by themselves because they start questioning, who am I becoming? Can I be the woman I am, or do I have to continue being the man that I'm prioritizing in the public spaces or in the society? So identity work literature gives us an idea of how people would work on their identities, how they would, I'm going to go one slide or two back, yes, how they would take social identities and make sense of identity work so their personas are managed or their personas are appropriately presented. And then there's a certain level of identity work that may be involved in them making sense of themselves in the private spaces. So covering is another example of identity work strategy where you would hide or cover some of your identity. So people who've had lighter skin but of African or Asian heritages would often strive to be lighter skinned in Western societies because they know there is benefit in presenting themselves or putting forward a persona that gives the other the idea you're part of them. However, that doesn't mean you've covered yourself in the front. That doesn't mean that you would not have an internal dialogue, wondering, who am I becoming? However, the missing piece that we did not see in social psychological literature, identity work comes here into place in defining, all right, you have social identity, you have self-identity, and your personas. The missing link connecting these three elements are the identity work strategies that you would employ. Yeah, because this is being recorded, I'm guessing people could go through the different examples of identity work strategies and also the representative citations if you are interested in further reading. And then I'm moving on to a topic that I just briefly mentioned, intersectional identity work and multiply identified individuals. So with the society coming to a place of people having multiple identities, social roles are blurring their boundaries, identity work is becoming hard. You no longer can employ just one identity strategy. Sometimes you have to use multiple identity strategies because you bring your whole self to the organization or the workplace or even the society. So in 2016, one of Utter Wogan's pieces talked about intersectional identity work. That is talking how the oppressive powers and dynamics of multiple social identities that provide as inputs are managed by an individual. Especially when you are a visible minority, you cannot control how people would see you, but you also would have social identities. When you're coming from a place of oppressive power, you need to manage all these intersecting identities at the same time. this is where we started talking about intersectional identity work. And my thesis also looked at how women in Australian workplaces used intersectional identity work to manage their sense of self and also manage the personas that they put forward as members contributing productively to the host community. So intersectional identity work and multiply identified individuals aren't necessarily concepts that are supported purely by social psychological viewpoint, because there was discussion or highlight given to roles and memberships functioning in isolation and separating social identity and the personal identity. So from a fundamental standpoint, we cannot successfully use intersectional identity work and multiply identified individuals as concepts or factors if you're purely looking at social psychological theories such as social identity theory and identity theory. However, in management literature, we are starting to see these are being mingled and mixed together. So these are being questioned now often by sociologists in management literature, because there are fundamental issues that these theories and concepts don't talk to each other, as they've defined two separate things as identity. So if anyone's starting off identity literature, looking at identity literature, I would say read the seminal work to understand the boundaries around social psychological theories and sociological approaches to identity, because without that, although intersectional identity, multiply identified individuals have become buzzwords and like recent upcoming research, you might have fundamental issues around how you conceptualize these ideas or how you construct identity around these concepts. So that's one of the key things I learned as I did my literature review, that I have to be careful which camp of identity literature I sit with. Although these are upcoming topics, they're the buzzword, I cannot just go back and use a different fundamental position and just plug these in. And they get questioned often if you do that for the said reasons of differences in beliefs and the boundaries within the identity literature. All right. Now I've done the information dump on identity literature and the theories, and like this is not my usual style to have a lot of information on slides, but given the audience, I wanted to give a lot of citations and information, places for you to start reading about identity literature. At the end, I have a reference list where you could go if you wish to work on these. However, because of the intensity of this information dump, I'll briefly take you through how I situated my views on sociologically informed work and organizational scholarship when I did my research on identity work of Sri Lankan skilled immigrant women in Australia. I'm hoping that this will give you the audience a place to start thinking around what to choose when it comes to the different approaches in identity. So my ontological belief, or where I stand, where I thought the truth is when it comes to research, is that the truth is relative. It is built on the connections of the society. Therefore, my epistemological assumptions supporting the idea that I cannot necessarily engage in a quantitative research in examining identity, because I do not, as a researcher, believe in a boundary-led truth when it comes to identity. This was something that I identified with the research that we see in social psychological research, is there's boundaries. There's heterogeneal view of what an identity could be. The male white managerial identity we often see in literature, I did not fundamentally agree that is the truth. Purely this could be because I come from an South Asian background and a person of color, a woman. I did not resonate. So some of these places I go in my approach to identity research is through lived experience, lived realities of how I constructed my sense of self. So it made more sense in my approach to studying identity is to consider that identity construction is relative, dependent on the socioeconomical and historical backgrounds, and also the social identities one would hold. Therefore, it is experienced subjectively. So where I stand, it was hard for me to fathom a quantitative study which isolates a social identity. And I couldn't believe that one person is functioning in isolation just by their social identity or the role identity. So because of this premise of me considering the truth to be relative and socially constructed, my approach to identity research, or me studying skilled immigrant women, took an approach where I considered, all right, I need to do an inductive study where they tell me what their construction of identity is, what factors came into place. And this also allowed, this approach to identity research allowed me to use or function within the realm of intersectional identity work, multiply identified individuals, because I've started to consider there are no boundaries. It is individual, subjective. They tell me what their construction of identity is. Therefore, I did not go into the field having an idea what it is to construct their identity, but they told me what it is to juggle multiple identities, being a skilled immigrant, being a mother, being a woman, coming from Sri Lankan background. How did all these different social identities come into work in the ways they present themselves, and what were the internal discussions that they had? So that is the reason why I saw a lot of merit in the sociological views on identity that I've used in my research. And so a bit more information why I made the decision around sociological views is the lack of recognition for social construct of identity, lack of recognition of that society inform how identities are constructed. So for me, when I was reading literature, it made sense the whole white managerial identity is coming from a place of privilege. They did not have social constructs that oppress them or influence how they see their role or their sense of self in the workplace. But as a person of color, one may say a person that's oppressed in the power hierarchy, I saw a lot of merit in considering the factors that come into place that suppress, but at the same time inform how I function in the workplace. In the management scholarship, up until recent time, the white male has been the heterogeneous approach. So it has been the benchmark where everything was studied according to what they've experienced. And there is lack of studies that help me define how a brown person in a host country workplace would see themselves. What are the factors that come into play when they construct their professional identity? Do they see being a doctor same as to a white person would see being a doctor? Would a doctor, a female doctor, see their profession as the same way a male doctor would see? So I had questions that were not identified or which were not answered in a lot of literature that made me realize there is lack of recognition if I take a quantitative part down, or if I take a social psychological view to the construction of identity. So, and again, another factor that led me to take a sociological approach is that I needed to place the actor in the society. Social identity theory and identity theory, we focus on the roles and memberships. We don't talk of the social structure or the institution that they would function in. I saw merit and also a research gap where you would hardly see being located in the world. When I say the world, as Berger and Lachman has said, it remains identity remains unintangible until it's located in the world, it supports the idea the world around and influence how someone would construct their identity. So that was another tick for me when I wanted to study skilled immigrant women in Australia. And also, when you take identities or role identities in isolation, at work, you don't consider life outside of work because the conceptualization doesn't allow you to talk about life and roles outside of work. That was a problem for me because women bring their whole self to the workplace. They bring their motherhood to the workplace. They make decisions. Being a mother, a young woman moving from being the young self, unmarried, being a mother at one point changes the way they make their decisions. There was lack of recognition for how that is done. So for me, isolating a social identity didn't resonate because I wanted to see how do these people bring the whole self? How does your other social identities inform how you make sense of being a professional in an Australian workplace? So given these factors to build a cohesive understanding of what sense of self is, the relationship between social identities and also self-identity and how people would present themselves. Sociological views, especially Watson's conceptualization around the 4 elements of identity construction, made sense and gave me a place to build my study on because it answered a lot of questions that a lot of management literature did not answer for me. That is building a connection between social identity, personal identity, and the personas that we present in the workplace. So that's how I kind of make sense of sociological approach to identity and then position my research in the sociological realm of theories as a thesis that's going into management literature. That's it from me. And I think I spoke a lot. I gave a lot of information. Happy to take any questions if there are any. Otherwise, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Gayani. And well, I'm sure there are questions from others. There I know a few who is considering identity theory as their or identity as a part of their study. So I'm sure they would have questions at least. Anybody?
Hi, Gayani. I'm also Gayani. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. I just wanted to, I don't actually have a question, but I really wanted to kind of thank you because I am struggling with social identity theory and I had not, I'm still very much at the inception stage and I like this approach of the sociological approach to identity and you have really given me a great starting point. So I really wanted to thank you for that.
Oh, lovely. Thank you, Gani, for the comment. But Arusha has my contact if you want to reach out and network and learn a bit more or like, pick a brain, more than happy to just reach out. And good luck with your studies.
Thank you. I think I definitely will reach out to you. Thank you very much.
Anybody else? Gani, I really want to thank you for the excellent presentation. We have a lot of DBA and PhD students here. So I hope that they understood the amount of work that you have to put through to really be very confident of what you've done and the amount of reading and understanding that is needed, especially in every aspect of your research, of course, but especially when it comes to the theory, you can't just pick a theory from whatever the theory is out there. You'll have to know the in and out of those theory, the historical development of that theory, the different perspectives to the theories, all of that, and then you very consciously select a theory that resonates with your philosophical grounding. So Gayani, you not only presented about identity, the literature on identity, but you also showed the amount of work that you put through and what a PhD or a DBA student will have to do in proceeding with their research. Gayani just completed her PhD, and you would see how, the amount of work that she had put in. So, well, thank you so very much for that. Any other questions? Yeah. So there is in the chat, it said, appreciate if you can share the PPT, PDF, please. I'll be sharing with all of you the YouTube link. So maybe that can, you will get the PowerPoint in that. Paul has raised the hand. So if you have any questions, please. Paul?
Hi, Gayani. Everyone.
Hello.
Gayani, I have a question for you. How did you separate yourself from your research participants, being that you have similar backgrounds?
Very good question. Thank you for everyone who's wondering who Paul is. This is one of my colleagues, actually. We did a PhD together. So I think reflexivity come in great value when it comes to doing research in your own kind, or often known as insider research. I put into place a lot of mechanisms that allow me to question how I interpret the information or the data that I gather. One of the easiest ways I did was through debriefing. With my supervisors, following a bit of data analysis, I would talk through around, am I making impulsive decisions because I am similar to them, or am I interpreting it the way I want to? So there was one example around, one of my data points or participants was a young mother who's given up her career to move to her partner's location and then to, raise a family. So I wrote, or I interpreted some of these content with myself forward, rather talking around how it is not the best way for her, it's the career and whatnot, how I would perceive what her identity would be. But then one of the discussions I had with my supervisor, he clearly pointed out, isn't this you talking? Is this what she said? That made me reconsider how I approached that bit of data and how I interpreted it. And it made sense for me to go back and look at the data and to separate myself and to see, all right, this is what I want them to be. There's a place for that for me to discuss in a chapter maybe on reflexivity or a section of reflexivity. But for the data purpose, this person's not telling what I interpreted. So I had mechanisms around debriefing and also active note-taking around what I felt that would connect me back to how I interpreted these ideas or the data points that I received. I think that was one of the most effective ways for me to separate myself, writing about my feelings around their stories, how they constructed their identity. So I had a place to look back. These are my feelings. This is not their interpretation. I think if anyone's doing insider research, that's a very good, that was very effective for me to start off and separate myself, write about myself in first person, and to look at it later when I'm interpreting the data. So yeah, the mechanisms such as individual debrief with supervisors and journaling individual thoughts were the techniques that I used as an insider researcher in this case. Thank you for the question, Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you. So if there are no other questions, maybe we can round up for today.
Miss,
But I will, yes.
I have a question actually.
Yes, Jyoti.
I just wanted to know whether when she's doing this research, she talked about sense making. So any, I mean, theory that she has used to compare with this, I mean, the social identity theory, or the whether she has used any other theories in her research, like sense making theory or Carl Rogers self concept, anything else that she used?
Yeah, Chetan, thank you for the question. So when it comes to sense making, I did not use a separate theory, but I went with the definitions that are found in identity literature, because I didn't want to add many different theories into my research, because I wanted identity and the conceptualization of identity to be the core of my research. But when it comes to defining and understanding sense making, I resorted to identity literature, which talked about how people would go through phases of sense breaking and then engage in identity work and sense make of their reality. So I took an approach to the lived realities rather than taking a different theory on board for this study.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I also want to thank Professor Mario Fernando, who actually was the initial contact point. I got to know Dr. Gayani through Professor Fernando. So thank you to him too. He's also here. He's the supervisor, one of the supervisors of Gayani. Thank you. And so if that's that, we will stop for today. Thank you everyone for participating. I'm sure you have gained a lot. Gayani, really appreciate your very informative, very helpful session, and I hope we can continue to collaborate, and please keep in touch. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Adhikar. It was really nice to, just go back to my literature and then talk about it and actually see. I went around telling people, oh, my examiner is actually testing me. So it's a good opportunity. And I think for a lot of people who are starting to do their research, talking it out loud is a very good approach to testing whether you've actually understood the content that you're writing or working on. And if anyone wants to reach out, talk a bit about what I learned through this journey working on identity, please feel free to. Yeah, and good luck to all the research students. And thank you for everyone coming to listen to me. Hopefully